Okay, I only see, Sarah, I only see you up on the top of my screen, but that's okay. As long as I have.
Oh, we need to make you to, we need to put the speaker active speaker, but how do I, Barbara, you're there?
Walked away.
She's
Okay.
muted.
Barbara's muted.
Okay.
Rain, if you do gallery view, you might see everybody. Gallery side by side.
Barbara, can you highlight?
Speaker, I guess
Speaker.
I'm on the speaker view. Okay.
Yeah, I know I'm not able to see everybody if I have the screen share up, but right now I
can you see yourself?
No.
When she talks, it should be her.
Yeah, speaker view.
Yeah, we have I have you on speaker view. So once you start, I think we will all see you.
Okay. All right.
I can mute us.
Oh, and we can all mute somehow.
All right. Can everybody see me and hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So we're going to be leaving, I'm going to be leaving the, my PowerPoint up during the presentation, but as we did last week, what I'll do is I will stop the share for the Q&A part, okay? So, at about 8:30 or so, I'll try to end, and we'll allow for discussion, because I think the discussion was really great last week, and I'd like to allow enough time for that, okay? So it's really nice to be back with you again. Really nice to see all the familiar faces at the beginning during the service. And I see someone had a wonderful background of the Hamantaschen, which was very cheerful and nice. So today just for those who might not have been here last week we introduced the topic of American Jews and social justice. And we talked about some reasons why so many Jews have been disproportionately represented in movements for social justice in America. And we proposed some theories about that, and we'll return to that in our last class when we wrap things up, to talk about why is it that so many Jews have been disproportionately represented in movements for social justice. And I remember that Rabbi Pearlstein asked a very good question last week about, what about the Jews who don't, who are on a different point on the political spectrum, the Jews who are more conservative, who would not have been involved in these movements. And as I mentioned last week, Jews are found at all points on the political spectrum, and there were many Jews who did not support movements for social justice, which tend to be on the liberal to the left wing of the spectrum, but not always. But there were Jews who supported these movements, and there were Jews who did not support them, and there were Jews who were indifferent to them, just like, in the rest of the population. But when we look at the movements, Jews are usually disproportionately represented, when we consider their percentage in the population. And that's one of the issues that we're sort of thinking about. Why is that? And we ventured a few guesses last week, and I mentioned that Jews who have been involved in these movements for social justice have a variety of reasons for doing so. Sometimes it comes out of a deep feeling for Judaism, and that this is an important, that Jewish law and Jewish tradition really mandates that we get involved in these kinds of movements. And for some people, it was the Jewish experience of persecution and marginalization that led them to develop a greater sensitivity to the needs of others, especially marginalized groups. And then for some people, they get involved because of for other reasons, not necessarily because they are so connected to not necessarily because of their Jewishness, but they get involved for a variety of other reasons, because they think it's the ethical thing to do, because of forces in American society. Some of those people eventually later in life came to a realization, oh, maybe my being Jewish has something to do with my activism. So, you know, there's a whole variety of stories, and some people were just involved in movements for social justice in America, and some people combined their social activism with a strong involvement in the Jewish community as well. And some of the people we'll talk about tonight were in that category. So tonight we're turning our attention. We also talked about healthcare last week, and Lillian Wald and Frances Stern, who was a nutritionist. And so we had focused our attention on healthcare, and all of the topics that I picked out for this series are topics that I think are very relevant and meaningful for us today, especially as we work our way through the pandemic and all of the issues that have come up in the last year. So the issue that we're turning to tonight is the labor movement and economic justice. And of course, we all know that Jews have been very, very involved in the labor movement and have made enormous contributions to the labor movement in this country, especially in the garment industry, but also in other areas as well. And many of us may have this in our family backgrounds. That is, we had parents, grandparents who were involved in the labor movement and who may have come here as immigrants and were involved in the labor movement in one way or another. So this is part of our family background. And this was brought home. I want to make a popular culture reference, which you may remember. You may remember the movie Norma Ray in 1979. And that was, of course, about a mill worker. It was based on a true story about a mill worker in the South. And you may recall the mill worker was played by Sally Field, and the Jewish labor organizer was played by Reuben Warshawski. And in a very famous speech, I was actually able to find it online. I remember the speech, but I was trying to find a reference to it. In a very famous speech, the character Reuben Warshawski, who was played by Ron Liebman, speaks to a meeting of the unorganized mill workers in the South. And he says, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but he basically says, my grandfather, Isaac Abraham Warshawski, died in 1970, he says. And then he says that at his funeral were the family members, but also 862 members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and Cloth, Hat, and Cap Makers Union. And then he goes on to talk about, in that famous speech in the movie, he goes on to say that in death as in life, they stood at his side. They had fought battles with him, bound the wounds of battle with him, had earned bread together, and had broken it together. When they spoke in one voice, and they were heard. They were Black, they were white, they were Irish, they were Polish, they were Catholic, they were Jews, they were one. That's what a union is, one. So I thought that, it's a popular culture reference, but I think it does capture much of kind of the Jewish passion for the labor movement, and the fact that very often this was part of people's family heritage. So in the case of, this character, the Jewish union organizer was carrying on the legacy of his grandfather. That didn't happen in the case of many other American Jews, because many American Jews experienced a rapid socioeconomic mobility into the middle class, beginning in the 1920s, 1930s, and beyond. But many did remain, in many cases, many American Jews did remain in the garment industry in one way or another. And even those who didn't had a kind of family legacy or a family heritage of that involvement, which continued to influence them and of which they were often very proud. So I just want to say a little something about the garment industry before we talk about individual people. Some of whom may be familiar to you and some will not be familiar. And as I mentioned last week, I've taken a biographical approach in this course to look at individuals and their involvement in movements of social justice. And one of the issues that we want to consider when we look at these individuals is, to what extent, how did their Jewishness influence them in their work on behalf of the labor movement and economic justice? And as I said, I think in the case of the people we're talking about tonight, all of them were influenced by their Jewishness one way or another. And we'll see that as we talk about them. But a little bit about the garment industry. As you probably know, the garment industry had been expanding in the 19th century in America since the invention of the sewing machine in 1846. And then because of the demand for mass-produced uniforms during the Civil War. So that led to an expansion of the garment industry and the development of the mass production of ready-made clothing. And it happens that Jews were beginning to come in. If everyone can unmute, I would appreciate it because we are hearing some background noise. So Jews were beginning to come in en masse. The Great East European Migration is from 1880 to 1924. And of course, there were Jews who had come here in significant numbers in the mid-19th century. And many of those Jews who came in the mid-19th century ended up going into the garment industry themselves and became factory owners by the time the East European Jews began to arrive. So this was a fortuitous set of circumstances. The historian Hasia Diner has pointed out that just at the time when the ready-made clothing industry was developing in America, you have an influx of Jewish immigrants, many of whom had begun to have experience in the textile industry and tailoring back in Russia. So Jews had begun to be involved in textile mills in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, in the 6 northwestern Lithuanian Belarusian provinces, particularly in Vilna, Bialystok, Vitebsk, and Minsk. These were areas where the Jewish labor movement in Russia became very strong. And you may know that that eventually led to the formation of the Jewish Labor Bund in Russia and Poland in 1897. So Jews were coming here with some tailoring experience, some experience with the textile industry, just at a time when that industry was growing and expanding in America. And they play a very important role in the development of the garment industry. So New York was a major center of the garment industry, but also Chicago and Philadelphia and several other cities had garment factories as well. And the majority of Jewish immigrants who settled on the Lower East Side entered these garment trades. So, for example, in one survey that was done at the end of the 19th century, more than 60% of the Lower East Side's working population were in the apparel industry, 23.5% in some aspect of business, that is push carts and small retail stores, a very small percentage rabbis, cantors, etc., and 5.9% were in the construction industry, cigar making, or other trades. So, a large percentage of the Jewish immigrants who came went into the garment industry, and the garment industry was dominated by Jews. So by 1897, 75% of clothing workers in Manhattan and 80% of cloak makers, that is coat makers, were Jews. And they were also very prominent in all segments of the garment industry. As you know, conditions in the garment industry were very difficult in terms of the long hours, the low pay, the unsanitary condition of many of the shops. And there was a study that was done of the Philadelphia sweatshops in 1910 by a social worker, Charles Bernheimer, who talked about the sweatshops on Lombard, Bainbridge, Monroe, and South 4th Street, which is an area that I'm sure is well known to many of you. So Jews become involved in the garment industry. They become leaders in the unions, in the garment unions. They create the United Hebrew Trades. They create the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and eventually the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, that of course do not only serve just Jewish immigrants, but at the beginning, many of the members of some of these unions were largely Jewish, but then people of all other ethnic backgrounds began to join them. And the Jewish unions became famous for what was known as progressive unionism, which included not only sort of what we would consider bread and butter issues in the labor unions, but also low-cost housing, banks that offered low-interest loans, education, health clinics and health insurance, cultural programs, educational benefits, etc. And the ILG and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers in particular became well known for their contributions in terms of progressive unionism. So we're going to go on and talk about some of our people tonight. One of the young women who was very famous in the garment industry for her contributions was Clara Lemlich-Shavelson. You may have heard about her. She's often talked about as a teenage firebrand because of one particular role that she played in the 1909 shirtwaist makers strike. But she was quite active in the labor movement before the 1909 strike and afterwards. So she was born in Ukraine, as you can see. She organized for the ILGWU, and she's most famous, as I said, for her role during the 1909 shirtwaist makers strike. So the shirtwaist makers were, shirtwaists were blouses, as you may know. And the trade was 80% of the workers in the shirtwaist trade were women, and 2/3 of the women in the industry were Jewish. So this was a branch of the trade that had where there were many young Jewish women, and also other women, women of Italian background, native-born Americans, etc. There were two factories that were involved initially in the 1909 strike: the Triangle Factory, which is sadly known because of the Triangle Fire in 1911, but this was back in 1909. So the Triangle Factory and the Lyserson plants had gone on strike. And the strike had been going on for about 5 weeks, but it was lagging because the employers were sending the work out to other shops, and the strikers were kind of losing steam. And so there was a meeting at Cooper Union, which was a great meeting hall for the unions. And this was on November 21st, 1909. And Clara Lemlich got up and said, issued a call for a citywide strike of shirtwaist makers to provide support to the workers from the two factories that had been trying to strike on their own. And this resulted in what became known as the uprising of the 20,000, where there were shirtwaist makers throughout the city went out on strike. Clara had said, according to a number of accounts of the meeting, "I am a working girl, one of those who suffers from and is on strike against the intolerable conditions portrayed here. I am tired of listening to those who speak in general terms. I am impatient. I move a general strike now." And then Benjamin Feigenbaum, who was also at that meeting, said that everyone should raise their hands and give the ancient Jewish oath from Psalm 137:5. That is the oath, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand wither, but they of course changed the words a little bit. This was not uncommon in the labor movement. And I think it goes to the point that I made earlier about how many of these people who became activists in the labor movement, these Jews who became activists in the labor movement, in many ways their activism came out of their Jewishness, because there are lots of examples of supposedly non-religious or even anti-religious people, Jews, who use all kinds of religious terminology when they address workers at union meetings, or when they write columns in socialist newspapers. So for example, Abraham Kahan, the famous editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, entitled his weekly column in the Arbeiter Zeitung, he entitled his column Sidra, because it was a discussion of the weekly portion, the Parshat HaShavua, the portion of the week from a socialist perspective. And Joseph Barandis, who was a very well-known labor orator, known as the king of the cloak makers, often gave speeches with all kinds of Talmudic references. So it was very common for workers and union leaders to bring in religious references, even if they themselves were not particularly religiously observant. And that's kind of an interesting feature of the Jewish labor movement. In any case, the strike was a very difficult, experience. I'm going to quote you from a young reporter for the New York Sun who talked about what it was like witnessing these strikers, and Clara Lemlich in particular. He said that there was a picket line in front of the shirtwaist factory, and I'm quoting from his article. The girls, headed by teenage Clara Lemlich, described by union organizers as a pint of trouble for the bosses, began singing Italian and Russian working class songs as they paced in twos before the factory door. Of a sudden, around the corner came a dozen tough-looking customers for whom the union label guerrillas seemed well chosen. Stand fast, girls, called Clara, and then the thugs rushed the line, knocking Clara to her knees, striking at the pickets, opening the ways for a group of frightened scabs to slip through the broken line. There was a confused melee of scratching, screaming girls and fist-swinging men, and then a patrol wagon arrived. The thugs ran off as the cops pushed Clara and two other badly beaten girls into the wagon. I followed the rest of the retreating pickets to the Union Hall a few blocks away. There, a relief station had been set up where one bottle of milk and a loaf of bread were given to strikers with small children and their families. There, for the first time in my comfortably sheltered Upper West Side life, I saw real hunger on the faces of my fellow Americans in the richest city in the world. And, again, I think this is it's a very poignant description. It's something that we can relate to today, especially with the long lines at food banks and people who are struggling with unemployment as a result of the pandemic. In any case, this was a description of what was happening during the strike, where very often the employers would send out thugs who accosted the people on the picket lines. Clara herself suffered broken ribs, and many of the strikers were arrested. She was arrested several times. So, this was the reality of the strike. The strike was finally settled in mid-February 1910. They did win many of their gains that they had hoped to win. And one of the biggest gains was that Local 25, which had started the strike, grew from 100 members to 10,000 members. So the ILG then became a major force in the labor movement. And the strike became a model. It was the largest strike by American women workers up to that time. And it touched off strikes in other branches of the industry and in many other cities. So it really led to greater unionization of women garment workers in general. After the strike, Clara remained very active. As you can see, she was very involved in working on behalf of suffrage, especially from a working women's point of view. She was an ILGW factory inspector. And then when she married, she became an advocate for housewives during the time of the Depression. Well, even before that, she worked to organize wives and mothers related to housing, food, and public education issues. She participated in meat boycotts and rent strikes. She was radical. In 1926, she joined the American Communist Party and founded the United Council of Working Class Housewives. And again, during the early Depression years, worked on issues related to unemployment, high prices, protests of high prices for food and housing, and high utility costs, and struggling to prevent people from being evicted from their homes. So these are some of the things that she did in her later years. And here's a very inspiring piece. At age 81, she moved to the Jewish Home for the Aged in Los Angeles and helped the orderlies at the home organize a union. I always find that very inspiring that she continued to work on behalf of labor causes, even in in the nursing home. So this is a quote from an autobiographical fragment where she describes what she did at that famous Cooper Union meeting. And she says, since every strike we called was smashed by the bosses, the union decided to call a mass meeting. And then I'm not going to read the whole thing because she's basically just describing what I had told you about in terms of what happened at the meeting. But she recognized that this was a very critical moment in her career, but she had a very important and influential career before the 1909 strike and certainly afterwards. So I wanted to move on and talk about a figure who's very well known to all of you, Louis Brandeis. And we're not going to talk about Brandeis's entire career because, of course, he's best known as the first, in Jewish circles at least, as the first Jewish person appointed to the Supreme Court in 1916. But he was famous in many other ways. That certainly he's very famous in American history for that reason and in American Jewish history. But he's famous for all of his judicial opinions. He's famous as an important progressive who took many stands against monopoly and in favor of trade union cases. And I want to focus just on one aspect of Brandeis's career, which is relevant for our topic for tonight. And that is he played an important role in mediating the New York garment workers strike in 1910. So after the 1909 shirtwaist makers strike, the next major strike, especially in the New York area, was the garment workers strike. Brandeis played a very important role. This was a very difficult strike, and the unions and the employers could not come to an agreement. Brandeis was called in to help with the mediation of the strike. And he felt that while he was sympathetic to the needs of the workers, he also felt that it was important to be fair to both sides. He was asked to chair the negotiations. And there were many Jews involved in the negotiations, including many Jewish leaders. And Brandeis was particularly impressed with the fact that the employers and the workers would speak to each other in Yiddish because, of course, many of the employers were Jewish as well, which I had mentioned. And he was impressed with the fact that they threw around these textual references back to Jewish sources, and that there was a kind of democracy to the interaction between them, because the workers felt very comfortably just yelling at their employers and being very outspoken in the discussions. Brandeis proposed the idea of the preferential union shop, which means that it wasn't only union members who were employed, but that preference was given to union members if the candidates for the people who were applying for jobs had similar qualifications. So in the end, the settlement that was adopted was called the Protocol of Peace, very well known in American labor history. And I don't want to go through all of the gains, but the workers did gain many of their objectives: higher wages, improved working conditions, the preferential union shop, which was it was not exactly what the union had wanted. The unions wanted a closed shop, which meant that only union members could be employed. But they did get the preferential union shop. They got a joint board of sanitary control to monitor conditions, health and safety conditions in the shops. And they also got a board of grievances, a way to air complaints, what they called a two-tier system. First, a board of grievances, and then a board of arbitration, which would include a a member of the union, one manufacturer, and one third party. Brandeis was asked to be the neutral party, and he agreed to do that until he joined the Supreme Court in 1916. So again, just like the 1909 strike, the Protocol of Peace became a motto in the labor movement. Brandeis had proposed many of the major points of the protocol. Ultimately, unfortunately, there were several strikes in 1914, 1915, and the protocol collapsed in 1915, but it remained a model for similar agreements to try to get workers and employers to negotiate together and to work out their disagreements together. Of course, later on, Brandeis became very influential in the American Zionist movement, and there are all kinds of theories as to why he did that, why he became so involved in the Zionist movement. And one of the theories is because of his role in the 1910 negotiations that led to the Protocol of Peace, that because of that, he gained a new appreciation for the Jewish community because he was raised in a rather assimilated family. And there was the influence of his uncle, Louis Steinmetz, on him. And Louis Steinmetz was a very engaged Jew. But many people think that it was Brandeis's involvement in the 1910 labor, in the settlement of the 1910 strike that may have contributed to his sort of awakening Jewish consciousness and his later involvement in the Zionist movement, which we could talk about during the discussion if you would like. So I want to move on to our next person who will probably may not be, here is a letter that Brandeis wrote to George Moses Price, who was a person who had been very involved in maintaining better conditions for workers in factories, and wrote many books about it. And in this letter, Brandeis says he talks about the Protocol of Peace, and he says the settlement of the great strike of the New York garment workers in 1910 and the relations between employers and employees constitute one of the most hopeful chapters in American industrial history. And he talks about the various accomplishments, and he says they developed an effective system for investigating and adjusting grievances. Here's a person who may not be quite as well known to you, Rose Schneiderman. She was a very, very important figure, started out as a poor immigrant from a very impoverished family, never really got the formal education that she had hoped to get because she had to start working at a very young age to help support her family. And she ended up being a great advisor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and actually coming and spending time in the White House, was a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and Francis Perkins, FDR's Secretary of Labor. So she was, she had quite a trajectory in her life. She had come here with her family. As I mentioned, her father died of meningitis, and she had to help to support her family. Her brothers were put into orphanages because the mother could not take care of them. And Rose had to leave school at age 13 and start working to help support her family, first in a department store and later in a factory. She started out working in the cap maker's shop, where she first learned about unions and organizing, and she actually played an important role in organizing her shop. She organized a local in her cap maker's shop, and she described her experiences in her autobiography, All for One, where she talked about how difficult it was to organize a union, standing outside and waiting for the workers to to leave for the day, and then passing out information about the union, very much as it's described and as it's depicted in the movie that I mentioned at the beginning, Norma Ray. She just talked about how, what an uphill climb it was to establish the union, but that then they were able to do it and that it was very successful. And this is what she said about her early union days. She said, "It was such an exciting time. A new life opened for me. All of a sudden, I was not lonely anymore. I had shop and executive board meetings to attend, as well as the meetings of our unit. I was also a delegate to the Central Labor Union of New York, which was a remarkable experience for me. The central body was in many ways an educational organization. It met every Sunday afternoon, and at each meeting, there was a speaker who would discuss some question of current interest. I always listened eagerly. The only cloud in the picture was Mother's attitude toward my becoming a trade unionist. She kept saying I'd never get married because I was so busy, a prophecy which came true. Of course, what she resented most of all was my being out of the house almost every evening. But for me, it was the beginning of a period that molded all my subsequent life and opened wide many doors that might have remained closed to me." So here, you have sort of the beginnings of her career. And she became very active in the New York Women's Trade Union League, which was a middle-class women's organization of women who came from much more privileged backgrounds, but who supported the working women. And Rose Schneiderman was accepted in those circles, although there were times when there was friction between her and the middle-class women because she came from a different background. And she was a socialist. So many of those other women were not. And so they didn't see eye to eye on everything. In fact, Rose was often betwixt and between, because when she was working in the labor movement for the, let's say for the ILGWU, she had to defend women's interests with the male union leaders who often did not recognize the special issues that women faced in the factories and shops. And then when she was in the Women's Trade Union League, she had to represent working class people in a middle class women's organization, and they didn't necessarily understand all the needs of working people. So she was an important interpreter of groups to each other. She became an organizer for the ILGWU. She ran unsuccessfully, but very interestingly, for US Senate in 1920. There's a picture of her at her machine. She was very tiny, very short, but was described by her enemies in the New York State legislature as the red rose of anarchy because she had red hair. And here's, as I mentioned, by the 1930s, this was a very, very interesting aspect of her career, that she was appointed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the only woman member of the National Labor Advisory Board. And in that capacity, she helped to develop she helped to work on the National Recovery, work in the National Recovery Administration, and she wrote the administration's codes for industries with a women workforce. She described that position as, quote, the most exhilarating and inspiring of her life. So she influenced the development of New Deal legislation. And then in 1937, she was appointed New York State Secretary of Labor. So it's quite amazing what she was able to do. And she, as Joyce Antler wrote, Joyce Antler wrote a great book about Jewish women, American Jewish women and social activism. And she said, it was a journey of many thousands of spiritual as well as physical miles from Rose Schneiderman's birthplace in Russian Poland to the White House, where, welcomed by her friends, the Roosevelts, she sometimes slept in Lincoln's bed. So she became very, very influential. And she wrote, she's very famous for this quote. She said she became a big advocate for suffrage. She helped to found the Women's Working Women's League, the Wage Earning Women's League for suffrage. And she said, my theme in all my suffrage speeches was that women needed the vote because they needed protection through laws. Not having the vote, the lawmakers could ignore us. I always said we not only wanted labor laws and bread, we wanted roses too. And she's very famous for that quote. That is not just the proverbial bread and butter issues of the labor movement, but that the workers needed higher things too. They needed recognition of themselves, of their individual identities, their need for culture, their need for education, all of those things. I'm not going to read this quote, but this is a very powerful quote of Rose Schneiderman's, where she says that she can't understand why people oppose women's suffrage. She says she couldn't believe that people were so violently and often so idiotically opposed to giving women the vote. And then she goes on to talk about her struggles about suffrage, and how when people opposed it, she said, you know, and they opposed it because they said if women voted, they would lose their feminine qualities. She said, well, when women work in laundries and foundries, you know, they're not the epitome of femininity in terms of, you know, how they have the difficulty of the work. And so she said what was really important is that women should have the vote so that they could advocate for themselves. This is a very famous piece of a speech that Rose Schneiderman gave after the tragic Triangle Fire, in which 146 people were killed, mostly young women, in 1911, and March 1911. And Rose Schneiderman was one of the people who spoke after the fire at the public meetings. And she said, "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in this city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. It is up to the working people to save themselves." Very powerful speech by Rose Schneiderman. I'm going to say a little bit about Rebecca Kohut. I don't know if she's, that's a name that you're familiar with. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much, just a little bit. But Rebecca Kohut is one of those people who was able to very successfully integrate her Jewish and American identities and her work in the Jewish community with her work in the larger American society. She was both the daughter and wife of rabbis. She was the daughter of Albert Bettelheim from Hungary. And she became the wife of Rabbi Alexander Kohut, who was very well known as one of the founders of the conservative movement in America. So she was able to, one of these people who managed everything, because she also had to be a wife and a mother. She in addition to all of her social activism, because when she married Alexander Kohut, he was a widower with 8 children, many of whom were very young, and she was much younger. So she came into motherhood in a very instantaneous way, and she had to balance that, as well as she supported her husband in his work, helping him with a lot of his scholarly work, but also was involved in a whole variety of social activism, working with the immigrant Jews on the Lower East Side, working with the National Council of Jewish Women. She was not in the labor movement, as many of the other people were who we've been talking about tonight, but she was very involved with the issue of employment and unemployment. So she directed the Young Women's Hebrew Association Employment Bureau in 1914 to 1915. And as a result of that, she became involved in the issues of employment and unemployment on both the New York State and the national levels. She was also a very strong supporter of women's suffrage. This gives you an idea of the ways in which she was recognized for her work on employment. She worked with the Women's Committee for National Defense during World War I, the Federal Employment Clearinghouse, the US Employment Service, and then the New York State Advisory Council on Employment, et cetera. So she was very much recognized for her work on unemployment. And one of the things that she did later on was that she went to Europe on behalf of the National Council of Jewish Women after World War I to deal with all of the issues, the Reconstruction issues that came about after the war. And she was particularly involved in helping to organize the women. So as a result, in 1923 in Vienna, there was an international conference of Jewish women with representatives from 23 countries, which then created the World Congress of Jewish Women, and Rebecca Kohat became the first president. So she had a national role and an international role Jewishly, but she was also very much involved on a on the national level with issues of employment and also with the suffrage movement. And here's a little piece from her. She had two memoirs, and this is a piece from one of her memoirs. I think it's her memoir, My Portion. And she talks about how she got involved with unemployed girls in New York. And she said some interesting things about unemployment, which I think are resonant for us today when we think about all of the people who are facing so much insecurity, especially because of the pandemic. She says, I felt a certain affinity with them. Girls the world over have the same emotional conflicts, the same spiritual trials, the same longings and aspirations. I had been poor enough in my life to know how economic misery multiplies these inner struggles. I would help these working girls fight for bread, for decent homes, for a living wage, for the bare elementary things of life. And she says that she was invited to become a member of the Board of Trustees. And she said, with the memory of the shirtwaist strike, the one we talked about tonight, still in my mind, I accepted, but on the condition that I be permitted to reorganize the Employment Bureau and become its head. There is nothing so destructive to one's morale as being out of work. One loses one's confidence and self-respect. Even if one has enough to eat and wear, it reduces the physical vitality. Human beings depend upon work not only for sustenance, but also for sanity. And then she goes on to talk about the sad scenes that she witnessed when girls were trying, she says hundreds of girls were trying to force their way into the Employment Bureau, and now and then some girl would sink down unconscious from lack of food. The unemployment period of 1914 to 15 was perhaps the most serious and widespread that America has ever experienced until that time. Literally hundreds of thousands were roaming the streets of New York, hungry and without shelter. Our employment work spread. Okay, I just want to mention two other people who I think are very important on these issues. One of whom I'm sure is well known to you, Rabbi Stephen Wise. He again was a person who was involved in so many causes, and like Rebecca Kohat, was very strongly involved in the Jewish community. One of the great leaders of the Jewish community, rabbi of the Free Synagogue, the head of the American Jewish Congress, the World Jewish Congress, and probably the leading Jewish figure, the prominent Jewish leader during the Roosevelt years. So he was very involved in Jewish life, and one of the people who said that his social activism came out of his Jewishness, and he was very explicit about that. The part that I wanted, the piece of his work that I want to focus on, he was involved in fighting municipal corruption and child labor and all kinds of other progressive causes. Suffrage, he was a big supporter of women's suffrage as well. He was a co-founder of the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union. So he was involved in many, many causes, both in the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community. But this is one aspect of his work that is particularly relevant for our discussion tonight. And that is his work on behalf of labor. He had given many sermons in his pulpit at the Free Synagogue in New York, dealing with labor issues and the right of workers to organize. But he became particularly involved in the textile union strike in Passaic, New Jersey in 1926. He and his daughter was Justine Wise, later on Justine Wise Polier, who became very involved in the strike as well and representing the workers. In fact, she was called the Joan of Arc of the mills. But Rabbi Wise was trying to help the strikers because they were being accused. One of the early leaders of the strike was accused of being a communist. Not clear whether he was or he wasn't, but this was a way to discredit him. And so the employers were making it very difficult for the striking workers. And Wise was trying very hard to get the American Federation of Labor involved because he thought that that would support the strikers. And the AFL leaders were unwilling to help the strikers because they were afraid of being accused of radicalism. So Wise took a very important mediating role here. He tried to assemble a committee with other clergy to help to mediate the dispute. Most of the clergy didn't want to get involved, but a few did. And ultimately, he was successful in getting the AFL to be involved and to help support the strikers. So this is a letter that he wrote to William Green, the AFL president at the time, saying, "I came to you 6 weeks ago and begged you to intervene in the matter of the Passaic strike. The situation has become critical and something must be done. The police are being used to smash a strike, although no violence has been attempted by the strikers. Upon you lies the obligation as the head of the largest group of workers in America to lift up your voice in solemn protest against the intolerable abrogation of civil liberties, which is being enacted from hour to hour in Passaic." So in the end, the workers eventually did get the right to organize and to collective bargaining. And the companies agreed to rehire the striking workers. So here's an example of, a rabbi who definitely saw himself as a social activist, but saw his activism coming out of his training as a rabbi and out of his Judaic heritage. His daughter, by the way, became a very important figure. She was became a justice in the domestic relations court and a judge in New York State Family Court. So she was a big advocate for children and youth as a judge, which was unusual at the time. And she later on was asked, why did she become a social activist? And she said, well, the legacy of her parents. She phrased it very well. Maybe I'll be able to find that during our discussion time, if you're interested. But she said, she had a wonderful quote where she said, "My parents taught me about social activism and I learned it from them." And many other social activists said the same thing, that they learned from their parents about this kind of activism, and then they carried that forward in their own life. Bella Abzug said something similar about her father. So because it was Stephen Wise was very involved in these causes, and his wife, Louise Waterman Wise, was also involved in many humanitarian causes, including an adoption center that she ran at the Free Synagogue. So I wanted to say something about David Dubinsky. I have a very powerful quote from him. David Dubinsky is best known as the longtime head of the ILGWU from 1932 to 1966, a very, very long tenure there. He was born in White Russia, raised in Lodz, and he was a master baker. He was involved with the Jewish Labor Bund that I mentioned at the beginning, which was a federation of Jewish labor groups in the Pale of Settlement, very activist. And Dubinsky was, he was a firebrand. So he was arrested a couple of times and finally was exiled to Siberia in 1909 for making radical speeches. But he escaped en route to Siberia, returned to Lodz for a short time, and then in January 1911 came to the United States, where he became involved in the Cutters Union, joined the Socialist Party, and then eventually went into the leadership of the ILGWU. which was, as I said, his major contribution to the labor movement. Later in his life, he was a leader in the Jewish Labor Committee, which helped to aid Jewish refugees during the 1930s. And he supported the Histadrut in Israel. I wanted to share with you a lovely quote by David Dubinsky. This was after he had retired, and he was asked by a 7th grade class in California to talk about his feelings about his life in the labor movement. And this is what he said in his letter to the 7th grade class. I think the date, what's the date? The 1960s, right? Yeah, I can't see it on my screen, but I think it's the 1960s. He said, "My life in America has been rich in service and experience. It has been my good fortune to have been associated for most of my adult life with a great union whose proud and justified boast is that within its ranks for more than 70 years, Americans of many origins have worked to advance together. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union is a miniature reflection of a country which is uniquely a nation of immigrants. I do not go to a synagogue, nor do I observe the prescribed rituals. Yet I consider myself a profoundly religious Jew, one who is constantly aware of his Judaic heritage. If I have served some larger cause, it has been that of rescuing, preserving, and enhancing the dignity of the individual human beings who must work for a living. If I have been moved by any single principle, it is that we must do for others as we would have them do for us. The record clearly shows my concern as a trade union leader with both the spirit and mechanics of ethical trust and conduct. I have been able to do these things in a nation which has given freedom and opportunity to millions who have come to it with hope. I believe I have in this manner fulfilled to the best of my personal ability, not only my duty as an American, but my obligations as a Jew." Yeah, so here the date is 1968. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and open this up so I can see everybody and see if you have any questions or comments. Okay, I can see everybody. Hi. So, please let me know if you have any thoughts about this. I know a lot of you may have unions in your background somewhere. I certainly do.
Hello, Irina.
Hi, Ira.
Thank you.
I don't see you, but I hear you.
That's okay. First of all, thanks for a wonderfully enlightening discussion. I had a question.
Yeah.
Many of the events and personalities took place around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and many of the Jews who were active in labor movements in the United States around that time were Russian immigrants, immigrants from Eastern Europe and Russia, and were also active. Can you comment a little bit? I know there was a great deal of tension between the Jews in a lower socioeconomic class and wealthier Jews like Cyrus Adler and Lewis Marshall and people like that. They actually, and they established a Russian Information Bureau, I believe, in Washington to counter kind of anti-Russian or anti-Bolshevik, or rather as an anti-Bolshevik force. So there was a great deal of tension between the different socioeconomic classes and also between Gentiles, many of whom perceived Jews as being communists and Bolsheviks and so on. And I was wondering if you could make a comment about the Jewish influence on the communist movement in the United States and how that ultimately led to whatever it led to later on in the 40s.
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, just to go back, you mentioned a number of issues. So first of all, there certainly was a kind of complex interaction between the so-called uptown Jews and the downtown Jews, right? So the uptown Jews were German Jews, largely German, not all from Germany, but often from German-speaking countries, who had come here in the 1830s, 1840s, and beyond, you know, even into the next decade. And then there were the East European Jews who came, and there was a complex interaction because the Jews who were here before certainly provided a great deal for the new immigrants in terms of institutions, charitable aid, etc. But they also were patronizing toward the, you know, East European Jews in many ways, and the East European Jews, by the same token, were very appreciative of the help that was provided by the uptown Jews, but also were resentful in many ways. So the interaction was kind of complex. It wasn't an easy black and white situation. But one of the issues that the uptowners were worried about, they were worried about rising anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. And they were worried that the East European Jews coming over who were looking foreign, some of whom were very religiously observant, and some of whom were radical in their political ideologies, which goes to Ira's question. And so they were very worried that with these, you know, large numbers of East European Jews coming and being very visible in New York and other major cities, that this would increase anti-Semitism in America. And I think they were mostly worried about the foreignness, they were worried about the religiosity, and they were worried about the political radicalism. So of course, not all the East European Jews were radical, politically radical. A lot of them were just trying to make, just like not all of them were religiously observant. But there was, there were certainly pockets of radical Jews on the Lower East Side of all stripes, anarchists, socialists, eventually communists, etc. And as I mentioned, Clara Limlich joined the American Communist Party. So there were some real radicals among them. I think there was concern on the part of some of the uptown Jews. There was also concern among Jews in general, as you say, Ira, because there was a lot of concern about communism, many Jews, even within the labor movement, took a very strong stand against communists. David Dubinsky is a good example of that, he was trying to root out communism within his union. And many of the other Jews were trying to do that too, because they were worried about these radical ideologies. And there was a certain allure of communism early on, soon after the Bolshevik Revolution. And then very soon, as you know, then a great deal of disillusionment about what happened afterwards. Yes, I think there were many Jews who were trying to distance themselves from the more radical Jews, and especially those who identified themselves as communists. And that continued, as you mentioned, during the McCarthy era, where Jews and Jewish organizations were trying very hard to root out communism in their organizations, because they were afraid of that all Jews would be associated with communism, and that there would be just because there were prominent Jews who were associated with left-wing politics, and then they were worried that that would increase anti-Semitism.
I guess what I was really asking, was, did the Red Scare and the anti-communist feelings in the 1920s ultimately lead to the 1924 restriction on immigration that ultimately prevented European Jews from coming to the United States? That's the backlash, if you will.
Yeah, I think that was part of it, but it wasn't the whole story. That was certainly part of it, that there was a concern about Bolshevism and bringing those people here. And then, as you know, a lot of association of, with part of the rising anti-Semitism was associating all Jews with Bolsheviks, which of course was not true. Just because there were Jews who were, identified with it didn't mean that you could lump all Jews in that category. But that was one of the accusations that was made by anti-Semites. I think part of what led to the 1924 or the 1920s immigration restriction was this fear of Bolshevism. But it was broader than that, because there was just an increase in general in nativism that had gone back to the late 19th century. And this this belief that America had to preserve its cultural homogeneity, and that anybody coming, especially people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, were suspect, and that they would not fit in as well into American life as people from Northern Europe. So the immigration law of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, or the national, it was also called the National Origins Immigration Act, discriminated against, it established country quotas based on the census of 1890 and the number of people from that ethnic group who were here in 1890. And the idea was to shut out whole groups of people or to reduce their numbers to a very tiny, very tiny number, which definitely gave preference to Northern and Western Europeans and discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans, which included East Europeans, Jews and non-Jews, and also Italians who were coming in large numbers between the late 19th and early 20th century. So it wasn't only the fear of Bolshevism, but that was certainly part of it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Sure. Denise?
Yes, thank you. So very interesting. And all of the people that you talked about were so fabulous and so forward thinking and accomplished so much during their lives. But my comment is that it's sad to me that today, because of globalization and the quest for cheaper and cheaper labor, that all of this is gone from American life. The whole quest for the unions in the garment industry and other industries are gone. It's done.
Well, it's certainly very different today. It's certainly very different. It was interesting that you may see, and those of you who read the Forward online, which I do, the Forward had an article this week about attempts to unionize in an Amazon plant in Amazon plant in a warehouse in Alabama. If you look at the Forward, you'll find the article. It's interesting, but they interviewed the president of the union that is trying to organize the workers in this Alabama plant, and the workers are facing a lot of opposition to being unionized from the employers. They're facing a lot of like real pressure tactics that they should not unionize. And the author of this article interviewed the president of the Retail Wholesale Department Store Workers Union, who's trying to organize these workers. And he's a man in his 60s, and he's also the president of the Jewish Labor Committee. He's very involved in Jewish things. He was on the executive committee of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. And it's interesting, he says that when he was growing up in a conservative synagogue, that his rabbi told him that all work is honorable, regardless of whether or not you have a job that requires a college education. And so he learned when he was young that this was part of his Jewish heritage to get involved in the labor movement. And he says some very interesting things. He says, even though many American Jews today might not be involved in the unions as they once were, that maybe they had it in their family background, but they're no longer involved in the unions. He says, I think we turn to those core principles that make us proud of our heritage. I'm incredibly proud that the Jewish community has been at the forefront of so many social justice battles, and I am confident that the Jewish community will continue to support working people. So it's interesting that this was just in the news this week. His name, the person they interviewed is Stuart Applebaum. So you may find that if you look at the Forward articles. I thought it was interesting.
I'll look for it.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that there are still Jewish union leaders today, and that they see themselves as part of this long tradition. Yes, Nina.
So I am a proud member, or was a proud member, of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. So, and Ted Kirsch, who just died last week, was the president before this guy, Jerry Jordan. And I wasn't around. I mean, I didn't start to teach until 1973, so I wasn't around during the big strikes. However, we heard stories of how the first votes the union organized in the high schools, and the elementary school teachers refused to join the union. And it took, I think maybe the first vote was 64, 65. I'm still in school, in high school. I was in junior high school. And of course we didn't know as a students, but later on when I came to join the union in 1972 or 73, the elementary school teachers, who were mostly women, they were adamant about not joining. They did not want to organize. And there was at one time going to be a split, but eventually they did vote to organize, and, you know, we became one. But it's interesting that this is timely, because Ted Kirsch, look, he was the president of the Pennsylvania Federation of Teachers and also president of our union for many years. And without our union, I mean, I see Shari Khan there, who was also, we got so many benefits, especially maternity benefits back in the day. They made you leave as soon as you started to show pregnancy. Now you can work up until your 9th month and not have to worry about that. And they held our positions for 89 days. So there were so many things won by our union for the benefit of the school teacher, that, you know, we had wonderful things. It's different now, but.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing that in. That it is very timely then, but thank you very much for sharing. Marvin?
Yeah, the unions acted to protect the workers from the power of the bosses of the companies. But I also will point out, my father was a member of the Ladies Garment Union. He worked in a company that made coats for children. The unions themselves were power structures. There was this contract with Sears, for example, to make coats that involved making a very large number of coats and giving the company the advantage of increasing their business. The contract with Sears was not only negotiated by the owner of the company, it was negotiated with the labor union. Net result of the thing was there were two results. First of all, my father had to work for less money because the large contract was such that the wages were actually reduced. Second, the labor union got a lot of employees, because part of the agreement with the company is the agreement had to hire many new employees, all which went to work for the union. So the union itself, and I remember my father was sort of concerned about his relationship with the union, because there was a line he had to toe. So being a member of that particular union, yeah, it helped him. It also did some things that were not so good to him.
I would just like to say one thing to sort of support Nina. I started with the teachers union. I started teaching a lot earlier than you. I started in '68. And I will tell you that I will stand with that teachers union right now to keep those teachers from having to go into those buildings. And Jerry Jordan is terrific. I taught with him for a long time, but without a union, you couldn't teach. And I know that people are saying, you know, the unions are bad, but let me tell you, you go into those Philadelphia schools and you're very glad that you have the union behind you. And, you know, they were fun to be in jail with, you know.
You went to jail. I never went to jail. I was too young to go to jail.
All right. You have great stories, I can see.
Oh, we have, believe me. But the thing is when the conditions in those schools, I retired in '09 and I subbed for a couple of years afterwards. The conditions of the buildings, I don't know how they can take a building that was coal heated back in 1920 and make it COVID safe in 2021. I mean, the conditions of the buildings are absolutely deplorable.
Mm-hmm.
And thank goodness for Jerry Jordan. Thank goodness.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, Harriet?
I have a different story. My father was a railroad engineer, and my grandfather, his father, was the conductor on the same thing. And as a result, they were very strong with the union. When my father got hurt on the job, he was able to be put on disability and was covered with all his medical expenses. You know, that I can't remember the name of the union, but it must be the transport union. You know, so as a result, when I worked in a hospital at some time and the nurses were talking about a strike with the maintenance people, I had said I would never cross a union line. It didn't matter what union it was. If it weren't for the unions, the people would not have anything that was like living. Like imagine the garment workers who didn't have bathrooms, you know, and they were females. If it weren't for the unions, and yeah, I know it costs money, but as somebody who witnessed the teachers' strike, and I had children in the school, I stood behind the teachers because they knew what they needed to teach, and not somebody who was working somewhere else in administration making these decisions. And that's why I told my daughter, she needed me on the picket line. She teaches in Philadelphia, that I would be with her. I would hold the sign with her.
Wow.
I think it's that important. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, so many of you have experience one way or the other, either personally or in the family. Yeah, I grew up on union stories too. A very typical situation where my grandparents were both, especially my grandfather he was in the Furriers union. And the funny story that he had was that, which became a joke in our family, is that when they were having a union election, and one of his buddies was running for an office in the union, and he kept telling my grandfather, the boys villain me, the boys want me, right? And so he kept telling my grandfather that that this man, not my grandfather, but that this man was very popular and all the boys wanted him and they all wanted him. And so comes to the election, my grandfather voted for him, for this man, and my grandfather was the only person besides the man himself who voted for him. So it became a big joke in our family when somebody was either running for an office or we were trying to figure out if someone was going to be popular or not. We would say the boys villain me. But we had lots of stories like that, lots of stories about being involved in the union. But yes, I mean, I think Marvin's point is well taken, that, you know, they weren't always there were problems with unions, right? And that's one of the things that Brandeis recognized, you know, when he was dealing with trying to be more even-handed in dealing with employers and with unions, because he recognized that unions could be at fault too, but trying to work out a system where they could negotiate together. So it certainly is true, but on the other hand, as you've all attested, the unions played a very important role in advocating for workers. So.
I remember the first day I went to work for a company as a co-op, I picked up a hammer and the workers walked out that afternoon.
Oh, wow.
You know, that, and the other thing, of course, is as of a couple of years ago, a worker making a car in Detroit was making $72 an hour. The same worker making a car in Japan was making $24 an hour. The net result of that, you know, if you're a responsible labor union, the net result of that is that General Motors no longer leads the world in making cars. I mean, yeah, some companies are bad enough. And by the way, you're all talking as teachers. The people you're fighting against are municipalities who are elected by other people. There are some companies that are so bad they need redress, but you know, sometimes you don't need redress because the owners themselves, you know, realize that the best thing the company has are the resources, and the resources are the people that work for you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, anyone else? Well, this was a great discussion. Thank you very much for sharing, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to tell you what we're doing for next week. We're moving to
Thursday.
the women's movement, gender rights. Okay.
Oh.
Yes, we may talk either next week or the following week. I'm going to include a little segment about immigration, because that's also a very big issue of our times. And I may try to fit it in next week as a not quite related, but semi-related topic, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Lewis Marshall, who Ira mentioned tonight, and Lillian Wald, who were very big advocates for free immigration. And will be, I'll mention their connection to the, their opposition to the 1924 legislation that we talked a little bit about tonight. So, because immigration is another big issue of our times. So I may try to fit that in a little bit next week. Okay.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Very interesting.
My pleasure. Nice to see you all. Everybody stay well.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Regards to your family, Rena.
Thank you, Ira. Same to yours.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.